Hello and welcome to the podcast of the final two episodes of the first season here on Battlestar Galactica. I'm Ronald D, the executive producer and creator of this version. And since this is the finale, I'm going to be recording this podcast. I'm going to do both parts together. And for both episodes, I'm going to assume that you have seen the episode before you listen to the podcast. So if you don't want the episode spoiled, I suggest you watch the episode first. The first part, first of all, I should say they were both designed to be shown together. It is really a 2-hour movie split into two parts, and probably the most satisfying way to watch them is to record them and watch them back to back. However, they are, perfectly acceptable episodes in their own right, and each one has sort of its own coherent narrative that you could follow. But it's a richer meal if you chose to watch them together. We started talking about the finale, I'd say midway through the first season, and there were certain things that we knew that we wanted to accomplish at the end of season one that I had set out, actually back in the story Bible stage, and presenting it to the network and saying that these were the directions of the characters. This is where Laura and Adama are going to end up by the end of season one, and we accomplished that. This Kobol's Last Gleaming in its finale in the second part definitely ends up where I thought season one should end. Now talking in more specific terms here about the episode, this tease is actually, it's one of my favorite teasers, not only in the series, but it's one of my favorite teasers that I've ever done. This idea of just, I guess I like it primarily because most of it is nonverbal. It's a very visual teaser. It's just sort of cutting back and forth between these disparate storylines. It's also an example of how things translate from page onto screen. If you read the draft of this, it's described a little differently. It started in close-up. It was start on fingers, cut to a woman's mouth, cut to a gun, cut to a woman's hands, and there was this sort of rhythm of extreme close-up cuts that I was establishing in the script. And in discussions with Michael Reimer, the director, you can only direct the show so much on the page. You have to allow the director to do his job, which is to actually direct the show. So, as a writer, I tend to find that I direct the movie in my head as I'm writing it, and I kind of have an idea in my head where I think the camera is, the close-ups, the rhythm of certain scenes and the editing and back and forth and so on. And you have to kind of let that go to an extent. You have to let the director and the actors and the rest of the team come in and bring their voices and their visions to the material. And this is a good example of that. This is all stuff that I wrote eventually. The boxing match, and Sharon putting the gun in her mouth, and Hilo confronting Caprica Sharon on the planet and going back and forth. The style of it and the rhythm of it and exactly what the shots are and how it's conveyed is really something that the director and then the editor between them put together, and it's great because you watch your material get lifted. Again, your hope is that you deliver a script to a production team that takes the material and improves on it and makes it better and makes it sing and makes it really alive, because it's really not alive on the page. It's really just words on the page, and it requires people to say the lines, and it requires other people to shoot them and somebody else to put it all together. And then on this show I had a tremendous team, and they were able to create what I think is a lovely, interesting and compelling teaser to the show. A side note about the boxing that we've gone through now a couple times. The boxing, I think, was something that was suggested, I believe, by Eddie and Jamie. Something that they thought of that Adama and Son could be doing in the tease of this show, and they worked on all the boxing, I believe, is choreographed by them, and how they did it and all that was something they worked on for quite a while. This reveal of her sleeping with Baltar was always in the original draft. I think in the earlier versions you didn't have the sort of fake out where you think it's Lee, and I think that also was a suggestion of Michael Reimer to, for a moment, think that it really is Lee, and then see that it's actually Baltar. I love the way these intercuts play, that you're going directly from the gun in Sharon's mouth, to Sharon being shot on Caprica and feeling, all these characters are in conflict, and all these characters are, at wrenching points in their lives, and it's setting the table for larger and more sort of cataclysmic events as you go on. I think it's also, in general, it's not just the culmination of what I wanted the season 1 arc to be. I think it's also the culmination of a lot of plot threads that we set up and character lines. I mean, this whole line between Kara sleeping with Baltar is set up way back when she first meets him, back in I believe, water. It's the first time she ever lays eyes on him and doesn't really care for him, but you could see there was a little bit of a spark. And Baltar being Baltar, he was eager for his next conquest and never quite let go of the fact that Kara Thrace wouldn't give him the time of day. And that, of course, made her all the more desirable to him. And the more she blew him off, the more interested he became. I also think that this is a great moment, and this is a really, really good scene because of the actors involved. There's really nothing going on here. I mean, there's not a lot of dialogue. There's really not scene per se. What it is, that the look on her face, on Six's face, and the look on Baltar as he looks at her, you start to realize for the first time that it's actually a relationship. It's not just a hallucination in his head. It's not just, a case of Baltar's imagination, and she's always playing the same note, and she's always cute and funny and making quips and seducing him. She says he can sleep with other people. She says that, love is not sex. She says all those things. And then he does it. Then he sleeps with Kara, somebody he might actually have feelings for, and it bothers her. That look on her face and his sort of, sidelong glance over at her, his sort of look of guilt on James's face when he plays that, I think speaks volumes. It's just a tremendous little piece of acting. And again, the tease is just this sort of lyrical intercut between different stories. It's not really just sort of handing you the plot. And I think that's why it's one of my favorite teasers. I think this teaser and the teaser for 33, which we began the season with, are my favorites of the series, certainly. It's 33. I liked it because it was challenging, it was provocative, it sort of grabbed the audience and said, okay, catch up, because we're in the middle of a crisis, and we're not going to explain anything to you, we're not going to spoon-feed you, all the plot and this and that, you're just going to have to figure it out, and we respect that you're intelligent and that you can figure it out. And this teases, again, just sort of, okay, there'll be a plot, relax, here are the characters, watch, take it in, see where they've been, remember what's happened to them, and sort of, be prepared for the things that are to come in tonight's episode. There are changes all over the place in terms of structure and sort of how we laid out the story. One of the changes is right here. This whole sequence of Laura in whatever sort of imaging system that they have aboard Galactica, and the continuation of her cancer treatment. It was originally scripted. All these little cuts, and there were more cuts, were supposed to be in the teaser, along with all the other little stories that you were intercutting. But Michael Reimer and the editor felt that it interrupted the flow that they had established tonight, this rhythm of going back and forth between the Sharons, especially, and then Lee and Kara, and there was a duality in how they were structuring the editing of the tease, and you were sort of sliding between. There were relationships, in other words. You were going from Lee and his father to Kara, and there was a relationship there. And then the two Sharons obviously had a relationship, and then Laura sort of in that mix didn't quite fit the puzzle that they were working out. So ultimately we just moved it into the top of the next act, which is I think a valid choice. This whole storyline that is dealing with here, and the prophecies and sort of the religious aspects of the show, are obviously something that have developed over the course of time and throughout the series. And I love the fact that it's tied into her taking a specific drug. I like the fact that there's question about what's causing her to see these things. Is it a drug? Is it actually a prophecy? I like all the questioning of it. This scene, this little bit here with Baltar and the glass, and topping it off and then drinking it. Again, that's just James. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of one of the real joys of the show is watching the cast members, embroider on their characters, find little details of characterization that make the characters more alive. And it really works because it really breathes life into the show in a different way. You can kind of tell that these people inhabit the roles in a different way than, say, 80 to 90% of standard television is done, where these are real people and they're in a real scene together. A note on the game. There was the game that they're playing, the card game, is actually, in the original series, was called Pyramid, for those of you who are studying such things. And somewhere along the line, I transposed the names. I sort of misremembered what they had called it, and the sort of racquetball / basketball game that they played in the original, and that we refer to in the series, I now call Pyramid, and the name of that game in the original, which was Triad, is now what we sort of call our poker game. So it's just one of those, it's one of the charming differences between the old and the new, and it's either that or it's just this stupid error that the writer made. Speaking of writing, these 2 episodes were the story is credited to my producing partner, David Icke. This was sort of his first crack at writing, and stroking out story for television. And so while I was concentrating on rewrites and sort of production details of earlier episodes, David was ahead working out, doing the heavy lifting, which is to really sort of figure out how some of these puzzle pieces work. And what are they? This is a very large story with a lot of complicated moving parts, and David was the one who took the first crack at sitting down and trying to line them all up, and that's a big load, and he did a great job, because if somebody doesn't come in and kind of do that at the beginning, then you have to do it all when you get to teleplay. So a lot of the credit for how well these 2 episodes works also goes to my partner David Icke. This is a good example, I think, of one of the textures that James does exceptionally well in the series. The notion of the man who has the invisible fill in the blank, the invisible rabbit, the invisible person, the demon on his shoulder, the ghost, the whatever. It's a riff that's done many times in many ways, and oftentimes, the actor who's given that part doesn't pull it off believably. A lot of times, you watch and you go, well, if I was there, I would know that he's crazy, or he's talking to himself, or he's talking to somebody else, obviously. He's not even making an effort to cover it, for God's sakes. And so you just don't really believe it. But I think that James carries it off quite well. He plays all the double entendres. He's careful to sort of always have a recovery point where he seems to be just ranting off by himself, and then he kind of redirects the line back to the people in the room like that. It's a delicate act, because you have to believe that he can get away with the things he gets away with. That, and even that look between Billy and Laura is an acknowledgement of the fact that not everybody can see 6. And and who's he talking to right there? He's staring around. He's a quirky, odd scientist, and I think that given the fact he's the only genius, he's the only scientist, he's the only man of his caliber in the entire fleet, plus he's been elected vice president, they're sort of forced to have to give him a freer rein than they probably would with somebody else. I'm glad that we kept this little tiny bathroom on Colonial 1, which is so much like an airplane, because it really conveys that sense of being in a ship going someplace. And this whole bit, the fact that she hurts him, the fact that that 6 can actually slam his head into that mirror and hurt him, it underlines the fact that she's always a dangerous character, and that she's not somebody to be trifled with. And it also really raises the specter of what is going on in this guy's head. I mean, if she's a chip in his head, she's exerting a tremendous amount of control over his body to make it fling itself against the door. But on the other hand, if she's just a hallucination, if he's just losing his mind, then his mind is taking steps to injure himself, to cause great harm and damage to himself, which I also think is fascinating. One of the principal difference between script and a filmed episode is that a lot of this was going to be, there was a device I was going to use that we may still use at some point, which was to intersperse on-camera interviews with the cast talking directly to the camera, as if speaking to an off-screen sort of interviewer, and they were sort of being interviewed in the aftermath of these events and looking back on them, and I was sort of intercutting those moments with the contemporary action, which I thought was a really interesting device. But ultimately, we just didn't have enough time to film it, and the episode was just too vast and big as it was, so we decided not to go there. I'd say one of the principal differences beyond the lack of interviews between script and film too is just that there were structural changes. The end of night 1 now is, Kara stealing the Raider and jumping back towards Caprica. In the script, that didn't happen until like the end of Act 2 in night 2. And the original ending for night 1 was the upcoming crash of the Raptor with Crashdown and his team going down in the atmosphere. We were cutting out on the action of that. And it was pretty. I mean, the script was filmed, and it wasn't really until Michael and Danny, who's Danny Cooper, who was the editor on this, were in the editing room together. Michael had always sort of voiced a concern that he thought Night 1 was a little too soft, and that there was just too much story in Night 2. And they were able to sort of juggle the elements and play it so that we could end. He moved up the whole Kara story so that we could go out night 1 with the great ending of Kara jumping away and Adama saying, she's gone home. And the Raptor crash actually does play out in night 1, and it opened up more room in night 2 to give all the moments in night 2 enough room to breathe. So ultimately that was a smart and important decision. Back on Cylon-occupied Caprica. You'll notice that it rains a lot. I don't know if I've spoken about this at all in previous podcasts, because I don't remember such things. But you'll notice it rains a lot in Cylon-occupied Caprica. Part of this is our sort of acknowledgement towards the ecological disaster that must have befallen the planet following the nuclear attack. Some sort of nuclear winter must have set in, or certainly climate changes are underway given all that's happened. And part of it is that acknowledgement of the reality of the situation, and part of it is also to sort of give it in an episode like this a distinct look that's different, say, than Kobol, which we're going to be going to shortly. So, as a producer, you have this challenge where you have 2 planets in this episode. You're cutting between Kobol and Caprica, and you need them to quickly kind of orient the audience and be visually distinct from one another, so that you're not confused on which planet you're on. These are the things that keep producers and executives up awake all night long. This scene I am quite fond of Lee coming down and confronting Kara. In the scripted version, there was a different. Forgive me, my phone somewhere in the house is ringing that I will ignore. In the scripted version, this confrontation came later. There was a different moment after the poker game, or after the triad game, where Lee started to realize that Kara had slept with Baltar, and he starts to understand that he basically publicly, outed Kara in front of the squadron, in the ready room, in the same way that Kara, pulls crap on the pilots all the time and gives people shit, and just generally, is not above practical jokes and public humiliation. And Lee turned it back on her and basically had a practical joke ready in the ready room and made it clear to everybody that she was sleeping with the vice president. And they all hoot and laugh and really sort of took it to her. And it was an interesting scene. It also seemed a bit out of character for Lee. We didn't really believe Lee would do that. This seemed more true, that he would just go down, and get in her face, and that Kara would have a lot of guilt and not want to go there. And then we've got boom, boom. I like the fact that it doesn't devolve into some kind of, scrum. It's not a fight. She hit him because that's what Kara is. Kara will throw a punch every once in a while. I think that's part of her character, is that every once in a while she gets pushed too far and she snaps and she'll hit you. And the thing with Lee was he hit her right back and then kept going on. So to me, that spoke volumes about their relationship, about who Lee is and who Kara is as well. Kobol, I was talking about earlier. The original series did an episode where they did go find Kobol, and I haven't seen that show in a while. But my recollection of it, and I didn't, was that they find Kobol, and there's a lot of pyramids on it, and it was like stock footage of Egypt that they sort of blue screened Lauren Green in front of, and he went into the pyramids and he finds, he's about to find the secret of where Earth is, and then it all goes to hell. going to find Kobol, the roots of humanity, the sort of birthplace of everyone in the Galactica universe, I was very attracted to from an early point. It seemed like a natural thing to do with the characters. It feeds directly into the larger mythos of the show. I mean, you sort of, at some point, you sort of have to answer these questions, or you should answer these questions. They're called the 12 colonies. They call themselves colonists and colonials. Well, the colonies of what? Colonies of somebody. A colony implies a mother planet. So, to find that mother planet at some point seemed a natural place in both the original series and for us. And it became, well, what is Kobol? What is this place? Is it Eden? Is it a paradise? Why did we leave? What's there still? What do we hope to find there? I mean, these were sort of a lot of the discussions that we had going round and round. This was a complex sort of scene that we had to handle very deftly, which is, she looks at the photograph, sees something that the others do not, and then relates that to an illustration here in the book. And that's always tough. It's, as a writer and producer, you're always sort of finding yourself in situations where you do have to rely on inserts, and you do have to rely on cutaways and things that are not present, that you can't see immediately on the set, and you're hoping like hell that later, when they finish the book, that you'll be able to see what you need to see when the book is actually done. Because 9 times out of 10, they just can't get the book with that kind of specific illustration done in time to have it there on the day when you need it. So you really sort of, you're hanging yourself out there over the edge a little bit, because it's a key plot point that she has to look at the photograph. The photograph has to read correctly, and then the book has to relate to the photograph, and you have to understand all this. This sort of section here is a key moment in the development of Laura's character, in that it's really not until that point that she starts to really accept and believe that the scriptures and the prophecies have some validity to them. Not only have validity to them, but may be literally true. That maybe the way to Earth is through Kobol, that we can find our home. And I think it's interesting to note that she comes to that idea not as a woman of faith, not as a woman who has like a quote-unquote personal relationship with her gods, but she comes through it logically. She looks at the puzzle around her, she looks at the pieces and the clues and what's been laid out for her and how they add up, and she says, well, this is what makes sense. I mean, whether it's prophecy or scripture or whatever you want to call it, what was written over there is happening over here, and there has to be a connection, so this must be the way to Earth. And it's sort of, she comes to it from a very sort of secular viewpoint on a very religious topic, and I think that sets her up into an interesting place as we move forward in the series. Back to the scene on camera, the scene between Baltar and Sharon. I liked this because it starts to move Baltar in a much darker direction. This is Baltar the manipulator, Baltar, not Baltar the imp, or Baltar the seducer, or Baltar the clown, or Baltar even trying to save his own ass, really. This is Baltar going, okay, this is a Cylon. She's kind of dangerous. She's dangerous probably to everybody, and especially me, because that's what matters most. She doesn't get that she's a Cylon. And here she is sitting in this room, obviously contemplating suicide. And Baltar shifts the situation and actually advocates her death and gets her to put that gun back in her mouth and try to kill herself. And it's a very dark idea. It's a very, almost nihilistic sort of notion that Baltar is starting to, bit by bit, take a more active role in manipulating events themselves, is not completely content to sort of watch the way things work out and sort of, play it by ear, as it were. I think all this editing and direction in this sequence, and throughout the show, but especially here, is quite well done. It's quite interesting. It's not really the way television is traditionally filmed and edited. Usually in much more traditional masters, much looser. You're not sort of going for the over the shoulder where you can barely see the actor's face. But it has the effect, when you use it correctly, it has the effect of making you feel like a voyeur in the scene, that you're sort of looking over Baltar's shoulder, can't quite see the expression on his face, worried about what he might be saying or not saying. And then you kind of break it, and you come out of here to a little bit more traditional framing, and you're involved in the scene, but you're feeling a bit like an interloper. It feels like you're sitting there watching it happen. And then he kisses her and goes away. I think one of the things that appeals to me about the show is the complexity of these characters. That they're not easy to categorize. It's not easy to predict their actions or what they may or may not do. I don't think Six even knew he was going to do that. And then there's just that guy running towards the door at the end. And we're back now. We're dealing with more of these insert shots and sort of photographs that we may or may not have had on the day. Yeah, the notion of permanent settlement was something that came up all the time. I mean, shouldn't they be Adama's mind, certainly they're looking for a place just to, camp and hang out and be safe and stop running through the galaxy and trying to, cobble supplies everywhere. But this notion that, here's an unknown planet, you can't just like go down and set up camp, you should set up a ground team. Now, in the script, in early drafts of the script, there were two teams that went to Kobol. There was the initial survey mission, which had Tyrell and Callie and Socinus aboard, and that mission stayed on Kobol throughout. They just went down, they landed safely, and they were surveying the planet, and then they saw a flash of metal off in the distance, and they said, "What's that?" And they took a look at it, and they found that there was a temple there, that there was a temple which was almost an identical to the one that was built on Caprica. There was a temple on Caprica that was very key as well. And there were these two temples. This was the sort of the large-scale idea. There was a temple on Caprica and a temple on Kobol, that they were linked, or not literally linked, but they were linked in that the original colonists had built the temple on Caprica to sort of emulate the one that they remembered or were told about that was originally back on Kobol. And a lot of the action took place in and around those two temples, and you would have the ground team of Tyrell and his guys there. They discovered it first, and then later a second reconnaissance team was sent, and the second team is the one that crashed in the original script, and that had Lee on board, actually. Lee and a bunch of Marines. And at the end of night 2, you had Lee and his Marines and Tyrell and his ground crew all holed up inside the temple, and there were like Cylons everywhere outside the temple, and that was sort of the cliffhanger. They're trapped inside, and what the hell are they going to do? And now this scene between Tyrell and Sharon, there was another scene that I believe we did film that had Lee coming to see Sharon and just reading at the riot act about how stupid she was, and you always check for a round in the chamber, and God, and her just going, God, I'm so sorry. And he's like, okay. And it's kind of one of those, I'm yelling at you, but I'm really glad you're alive kind of moments. But ultimately, this is the one with the heart. This one's more effective. I don't think we were able to keep the other one for time, but I think this is a better scene in any case. And and we mentioned that can't believe you didn't check for a round or a round in the chamber is much more offhand and much easier to get the idea across than sort of a bigger, more elaborate scene with Lee. Now this, of course, is the crux of the matter. It's this conflict between Laura and Adama traces back to the miniseries. From the moment in the miniseries at the end when they strike their deal that Adama will be in charge of the military and Laura will run the fleet, while a valid and needed compromise at the time, it's also clear that it's not going to work in every situation, and there will come the day when Laura wants to go left and Adama wants to go right, and what are they going to do? And this is, it was such an obvious thing to do that I wanted to make a big deal out of it. I wanted to see them try to work it out all season long. I wanted to play the tensions between the civil and military authorities and their personal relationship, by this point in the season, they have developed, some trust and faith in one another. They know that the other one is a good and decent person, but they do have differing points of view. They do have, their own perspectives on things. They do have different priorities. Her primary focus is the civilians under her care. His is the protection of the civilians under her care and the survival of his own ship. And those ideas are sometimes in conflict with one another. This whole beat of Laura trying to talk him into this, I think, is interesting, because it also shows that Adama is a very secular man. He's not dismissive of her faith and her religion, but he's a bit uncomfortable with it. He doesn't quite know what to do with it. He's not real happy that she's suddenly gone into this territory, but he's not going to be offensive to her. And Laura, I think, you could tell in her performance, is having to make an argument based on something that she's not entirely comfortable with either. It's not entirely comfortable for her to make such an outwardly religious argument. Now, like I said, this was originally the sequence here of jumping to Kobol with the Raptor ground team was originally going to be the end of Night 1. And in subsequent versions of the script, we eliminated there being 2 trips to Kobol. We decided that this would be the one ground survey mission that went to Kobol at all. And that's like a great moment. That was David Icke's idea, that he just looks up and a Cylon Raider slams into the Raptor, and we've just jumped right into the middle of a nightmare here. And there's Cylons everywhere. The Raptors are trying to escape. This was all very complicated business. A lot of visual effects work. A lot of sort of mapping out how things happen and in what order and what sequence. That I like a lot. That the Baltar. It's like, get Baltar out of there. Get crashed down, and somebody in the cockpit, move him out of the way. This is very cramped on the inside of that Raptor. It's a very small space with a lot of people trying to move around, and it was a real challenge to film in there. They hate filming scenes like this with so many people inside that little Raptor, but it conveys what it needs to convey. It's a claustrophobic space. Military aircraft and transports are not built for comfort, and we cram a lot of people into them, and when things go bad, they go really bad, and they're scary, bad places to be. Coming up on, okay, there goes the other Raptor, jumps back to Warren Galactica, and then this, now she's going down. I love the fact that we cut away from it. I like cutting sequence out like that and going to really placid scenes with somebody else, and the audience just sort of going, "Oh, but wait, what's happening? Oh my God!" and then going back and picking up the action later. It's a nice, sort of editorial device that I like to use in the show a lot. Those little transponders, you might recognize one of those was established in the miniseries. They found one of those in CIC in the miniseries and didn't know what it was. Now they know it's a transponder. The other transponder was actually filmed in a scene that was not included in the show Flesh and Blood, where Leoben had one of those as well. And I think we included that previously on. The spider webbing of the canopy, going in, the glass, the air, the wind, you're going down in the atmosphere, It's great. It's great stuff. You don't get to do this kind of stuff typically on a television budget. And like I said, this was the ending of Night 1, was them looking and going, "Oh my God, where are we going?" And I think they were just spiraling down. Yeah, it was right there. That was going to be the act break of the cliffhanger. So now we're in a crisis. Now we know that there's at least one base star out there, or base ship out there. The Cylons are around Kobol. We've got to get our people out of there. What do we do? And again, the conflict between Laura and Adama is not over. Laura wants to use the Raider to get back to Caprica. Adama sees it as simply a military asset. But she knows, what I think is interesting is that she knows better than to suggest that, she doesn't bring the argument up again. She knows it's helpless. She's not changing Adama's mind, but she's already on to her next theory, which involves this young lady here. One of the things I always liked was the notion that as soon as Starbuck became a woman, it changed the dynamic here. That there was always going to be some kind of tension between him and her because he's a man and she's a woman, and that was the fundamental reason why to change her to a woman. It made this relationship more interesting. They're comrades in arms, they're friends. Are they ever going to be anything more than that? Maybe, maybe not. But it's complicated by the fact of where they are, and that first and foremost, they're pilots fighting in a war, and they have to try to keep the personal and the professional in separate categories in their minds. And that, to me, makes it more complicated. And I think it's always going to be complicated when you put men and women into these situations. When you ask them to serve side by side in a police station, a firehouse, an aircraft carrier, lives are at stake. There are professional duties that must be carried out. There's hierarchies. There's chains of command. It becomes complicated, and none of the answers are so easy. And I think that's an interesting place to set drama, because when the answers aren't easy, that's great. That's what you want. You want to be able to play all those beats. This is, key, because it's important to sort of understand the stakes of what's going on. That Laura is not taking this decision lightly, or what she's about to do. I think in the script these were longer. This is a longer scene. I think a lot of times, you'll find as a writer that you tend to over-explain things, or you tend to try to overwrite things because you're trying to make sure that the people who read it understand all the intentions. And sometimes I do that intentionally. Sometimes I will intentionally overwrite a scene and over-explain something to get the idea in the reader's mind. When I say the reader, I mean everybody: the director, the actors, the studio, the network, etc. Overwrite the scene, explain too many things, so that everybody gets the intention, everybody's clear, that you don't get the sort of "I'm confused" note, which is one of the most deadly notes you get. It's confusing, I didn't get it. Let them get it, and then you can pare back from there and whittle it down to the more core components. And less is more. You can get away with saying far less than you think you can 9 times out of 10. Usually you'll find that there's a lot of excess stuff in scenes. A lot of ideas, sometimes are repeated within scenes. And sometimes just a look from a character will say it all. But it's important, at least in my experience, that the initial read, somebody, when they first get the draft, that they understand the intentions of all these things, and then later you can cut it out and say it with looks, and do it with less dialogue, and pare the scene back either on the stage or in the editing room, and get it down to its true fighting weight for the audience, because the audience has the benefit of watching it happen and seeing it visually, and the reader just has the words on the page. And a lot of time readers get caught up in, if you have too much prose, too much description describing, and Laura's thinking that, and she looks off to the left, and Starbuck takes a sigh and rolls her eyes and fiddles with the thing, the reader gets kind of bored and kind of jumps on to the next paragraph. And it's not uncommon for people who read your scripts to really skim the description and really skim a lot of things and just read the dialogue and keep going, which is fine. But it means that sometimes you have to put more into dialogue than is truly necessary, because you'll have said something in a paragraph of description that they didn't even read, and they just read the dialogue, and then they were confused because they didn't understand it. So you write it all in the dialogue so that they go, oh, and then you usually get the note, well, I think the scene's a little too talky, and the scene could be shorter, and you could probably cut a half page out of this, and you go, yeah, I think I can do that, because that was your intention, from the get-go. Again, as I said earlier, these episodes are the culmination of a lot of things. I mean, this basic notion of does Adama know where Earth is something that was established in the miniseries. I mean, and it's something we never forgot about, but it wasn't going to be something they talked about every week. It's not going to be a constant thing about, hey, do you think the old man knows where Earth really is or not? I wanted to just seed it in. It's there. It's mentioned a couple of times in the latter part of the season. But this is where it really comes front and center, where you realize that when Adama said that to all those people in the Great So Say We All scene of the miniseries, that those people in that room and beyond took him at his word and invested a tremendous amount of hope in that idea and a tremendous amount of belief. And no one more so than his surrogate daughter, Starbuck. The woman who we've seen him risk literally, the entire fleet to save. He loves her like a daughter. She loves him. This is a very, very strong relationship that is very close and important to him. And he lied even to her. And I think it's her anger at that, her betrayal at that, her discovery of that is really all that. The only way that I could see that Kara was going to steal that, not steal, was really going to hijack the Raider and fly it back to Caprica, because there was just no way. There was no way, no matter what argument Laura gave, no matter how convincing she was, no matter how intelligent, rational, passionate, whatever, no matter what she said, there was no way Kara was going against Adama unless she realized that Adama had betrayed her first. This whole little sequence actually took place much earlier. This is a combination of two scenes. We shot them both. It was going to be a jump prep test early in the episode to just reestablish the Raider and show that they were working on the FTL drive and getting ready to figure out how to jump it around. And it did take a couple of preliminary jumps, and those were successful. And then there was a second test, which now we're into that part of the footage, where Kara actually uses the test as an excuse to jump back to Caprica, and we essentially combined, or Danny and Michael rather, combined those two sequences into one. So we just have the one moment out here. And again, this is now the end of night one. I think it was a very smart decision that Michael and Danny made to change the end of night one from the crash of the Raptor to this, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that the original ending that I had of the Raptor going down is a plot element. It's standard Jeopardy, and it's plot. It's a bunch of people in danger, and you're yelling as you go down through the clouds, and you end, and it's nice. It would have worked, but it's nothing you haven't seen before. I think that ending it on this note, this is an emotional beat. This is about the characters. Forget the plot thing about her flying back to Caprica and the Arrow of Apollo and all that. It's really about these people. It's about Kara's feeling of betrayal. It's about what she's willing to do now because her father figure has betrayed her, and her being Starbuck and going off on some crazy ass thing that nobody else wants her to do, and Adama knowing it and realizing what has happened and that he's in some way responsible for it too. That's Battlestar Galactica. That's what the show is about. It's about these characters. It's a drama first, and I think it was very wise, to go out on this beat. And I'll come back and talk to you about night 2 very shortly.